I wanted to come over to talk about some legislation that I've been working on. As we all know, and I'm sure you've been discussing this today, to avoid the worst effects of the climate crisis, we have to cut carbon emissions in half by 2030 and then to net zero by 2050. And so while I've been talking to Xcel Energy and lots of other people about this, we know we need to eliminate the carbon emissions, but we don't yet have the full technology to do that to a 0%. Wind and solar are critical, and we need to increase their use dramatically, but without breakthroughs in technology, those two sources alone will not get us to the 0%. And so I think we all agree we need innovation and technology to provide the reliable electricity that we've come to expect. So here's what the legislation I expect to be introducing in the next few weeks will do. And I still hope we can do it on a bipartisan basis. Part of what it does is it encourages the development of the widest possible array of technologies to produce emission-free electricity. And it sets us on a course to having affordable, reliable, and 100% emission-free electricity by 2050. So I want to ask this panel some general questions that I've been thinking about in working on the bill. Mr. Dennis, I wanted to ask you, since spurring innovation is the goal of this hearing and also of my bill, I wanted to ask you about some of the advances that we've had in energy technology that have helped bring down the cost of solar and wind energy. Were those technological advances driven by the private markets alone, or did federal policy play a role in driving the development of the technologies we have today?
It was certainly a mixture. Federal policy certainly played a role in terms of we had long-term tax incentives for investments in these technologies. We had research and development. DOE had and has a long-time effort around wind and solar as well.
Right.
So it's a combination.
It's a combination. So you need both private and federal policy. So I want to ask, as we try to develop these technologies in the next few decades, is it fair to expect that new clean energy technologies will be invented in time to bring us this affordable, reliable, net zero electricity by 2050 without a change in federal policy, or do we need a federal change?
We need a federal change. We need the federal government to set the direction, and as you mentioned as well, and as many others have mentioned, R&D is going to be important too.
Thank you. Dr. Palmer, the legislation I've been working on would, among other things, establish a clean energy standard that gradually increases until we are generating 100% of our electricity using zero-emitting technologies. And so what it does is it's designed to reward investment in clean energy technologies without adding to the size of the government. And I'd like to ask you, it's my understanding that a clean energy standard by its design would help keep electricity prices low compared with other carbon pricing mechanisms. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Congresswoman. So traditionally, approaches that apply a direct price on carbon are going to create a source of revenue, and that will pass through in the effect that it has on consumer prices of electricity, as long as that revenue is not used to offset the increase in electricity rates. So a clean energy standard, on the other hand, provides an incentive to produce electricity from clean sources by rewarding that and creating a demand for that attribute in a marketplace. And so that will have a lower impact on electricity prices. And, you know, with the carbon pricing approach, often it's been proposed that the money be dividend back to households, and that could mitigate, or would actually, particularly for low-income groups, largely mitigate the impact on residential consumers. But a clean energy standard would make a more broad-based mitigation of that impact.
Thank you. Finally, what we're trying to do with this bill that I'm doing is to drive innovation and accelerate the use of new technologies. Some of my colleagues have worked on similar measures, but they're not addressing deployment of the new technology. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Izzo and Anderson, briefly, if we seek to foster clean energy innovation without giving power companies a reason to deploy technologies, do you think they'll be adopted universally in time to bring the emissions to net zero by 2050? Why don't we start with you, Mr. Izzo?
Yeah, I do not. I think a hallmark of utility service has been universal access, and that would be true in a renewable world as well.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson, briefly.
I agree with that statement. I would just say that as technologies are emerging, that we are developing programs to train people to work on them, to maintain them. But I agree with the essential point that he just made.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.